There are visions in the life of Saint Teresa that lift the soul toward heaven, and there are others that shake it to the core. This is one of the latter. She writes that one day, while she was quietly absorbed in prayer, a sudden heaviness pressed upon her spirit. It was not fear, but a grave silence, the kind of silence that precedes revelation. In that stillness, God permitted her to see something dreadful, the fate of a soul who had mocked the faith during his life. The vision did not unfold slowly. It struck her, she says, like a veil torn away in an instant. And behind it, she saw a soul falling, not wandering, not rising in confusion, falling with a terrifying swiftness, as though carried by the weight of its own rebellion. Teresa explains that this man had made a habit of scorning sacred things. He laughed at confession, ridiculed devotion, treated the Eucharist as superstition. To him, prayer was foolishness, and the church a human invention. He mocked what others revered, and he mocked it proudly. In the vision, she saw what pride becomes when stripped of the body. She writes, "His soul plunged downward like a heavy stone, drawn to darkness as if it belonged there." There was no resistance, no cry for mercy, not even surprise. The fall was immediate, final, cold, as though the soul had already chosen this destination long before death. Teresa saw demons seize him the moment he entered their domain. They did not need to fight for him. They claimed him the way one claims what is already one's own. Their laughter, she says, echoed like a cruel triumph. What shook her most was not the terror of hell, but the absence of remorse. This soul did not plead, did not regret, did not even look toward the light. It had mocked grace for so long that it no longer recognized it. In that instant, Teresa understood what God wanted her to see. That mockery of holy things does not merely wound the church. It hardens the soul. Pride becomes armor, and that armor becomes chains. She trembled as the vision faded, not because she judged him, but because she saw how easily a heart can drift from reverence to ridicule, and from ridicule to ruin. And she prayed, urgently, sorrowfully, for all who laugh at what is sacred, unaware of the darkness that waits for such laughter when life is over. Saint Teresa often said that no great fall begins suddenly. The soul does not leap into darkness. It drifts toward it, one small rejection at a time. In this second vision, she reflects not only on what she saw, but on what she understood in the moment God revealed the fate of the soul who mocked the faith. She writes that the Lord allowed her to perceive how such a tragedy begins, not in grand acts of evil, but in the subtle, quiet dismissals of grace. Teresa explained that in life this man did not begin as an open blasphemer. Instead, he started with small indifferences, a shrug at the commandments, a careless word about the church, a laugh during prayer, a habit of treating sacred things as trivial. Every grace rejected, she writes, left a shadow upon his soul, so slight he did not feel it. The shadows gathered slowly, gently, almost politely, but they gathered. What terrified her was how ordinary the process was, how easy, how familiar. She saw that he lived surrounded by opportunities for conversion, sermons heard, confessions available, masses offered, Christians around him praying, yet he ignored them all, not violently, not angrily, simply with the quiet disdain of someone who believed he needed nothing from God. Teresa says that in her vision, God showed her the man's final years. He had become a person who no longer felt the weight of sin or the sweetness of mercy. His heart had grown numb. Prayer seemed foolish to him because he no longer understood the language of grace. The church seemed unnecessary because he had extinguished the spark of faith within himself. And in that numbness, mockery took root. She writes, "He laughed at what others revered because he had ceased to feel what they felt." Mockery was not the beginning of his fall. It was the final symptom. The soul, that later plunged like a stone, had first become hollow, emptied of reverence. When he mocked God, it was not out of strength, but out of spiritual starvation. Teresa trembled as she realized this. A soul grows heavy, not from great sins alone, but from countless small refusals of grace. And she recorded this vision so that others might see what he never saw, that the heart grows toward what it chooses, light or darkness, one small step at a time. Saint Teresa writes that God sometimes permits his servants to witness the hidden truth of a soul's final moment, not to condemn, but to awaken. And in this vision, she was shown the instant when the man who mocked the faith passed from time into eternity. She says that as his final breath approached, heaven did not open with light. Instead, she sensed a chilling stillness around him, as though the air itself hesitated. The man felt nothing unusual, for his heart had long been closed. But Teresa saw what his eyes could not. At the moment his soul left his body, there was no angel to receive him, no radiance, no gentle guidance toward the light. Instead, she saw an emptiness, a void where grace should have been. The soul rose only for a brief instant, as all souls do, and then recoiled from the brightness that touched it. He fled from the light, she writes, as one who cannot bear what is pure. This was the most terrible part. The soul was not pushed into darkness. It turned toward it. For years he had mocked what was holy. Now holiness felt unbearable. The divine light, the same light that comforts saints, appeared to him as torment because his soul had been reshaped by pride. Teresa understood in that moment why Scripture speaks of the heart hardening. His was no longer capable of bending. It had become rigid in its resistance. Then she saw the demons approach. They did not rush or fight. They came as ones who already possessed what they claimed. Their presence was not chaotic, but chillingly orderly, as though they had been watching, waiting, knowing the hour would come. When they reached him, the soul did not resist. He followed them willingly, not because he desired them, but because he could not endure the nearness of God. It was then that Teresa understood a terrifying truth. Hell is not merely a punishment. It is a soul's chosen trajectory. God does not force the soul downward. The soul moves toward the realm it has shaped itself to love. As she watched him descend, she felt no anger toward him, only sorrow. Sorrow for a man who spent his life laughing at what could have saved him. And she realized that death does not change the heart. It reveals it. What we love in life, we seek in death. What we despise in life, we flee in eternity. And the soul that mocked the faith fled its maker the moment it met him. Saint Teresa writes that once the soul descended, God permitted her to see, only for a brief and terrible moment, the realm into which it fell. She emphasizes that the vision was not given for curiosity, nor for terror, but to impress upon her the gravity of mocking holy things. What she saw, she says, left her trembling long after the vision ended. She describes the descent as sudden, like a star plummeting from the sky. The soul dropped quickly, swallowed by a darkness that was not simply the absence of light, but the presence of something living, intelligent, and hateful. The shadows moved with purpose. They were aware of the soul that had entered their domain. Teresa saw that the darkness had weight. It pressed upon the soul, not crushing it physically, but suffocating all that remained of its dignity. She writes, It was as though the very air rejected holiness and sought to extinguish it entirely. And the soul, which had mocked grace in life, found no grace now to cling to. The demons approached not with rage, but with victory. Their laughter echoed through the darkness, sharp and cold. Teresa says that their joy was not in tormenting the soul, they would do that later, but in possessing what had been lost to God. It was the triumph of pride over repentance. She saw one demon hold the soul with a grip that was not physical, but spiritual, as though binding it with the very mockery the man had spoken during his earthly life. Another circled with malicious delight, whispering lies the soul had once believed, lies it had repeated to others, lies that now chained it. What struck Teresa most deeply was how the soul reacted. It did not cry out for God. It did not call on Christ. It did not even struggle. It seemed to sink willingly, not because it desired hell, but because it no longer recognized anything else. She writes, "It had shaped itself for darkness, and darkness received it." The terror of the vision did not come from what the demons did, but from what the soul had become. A soul that mocked holiness on earth now cowered from it in eternity. Teresa understood, in a single terrible moment, the true consequence of ridicule, not merely the rejection of faith, but the disfigurement of the soul itself. A soul that laughs at God eventually loses the capacity to see him. And in that abyss, she realized, the mockery that seemed so harmless in life became the chain that pulled the soul into everlasting night. Saint Teresa writes that as she watched the soul sink deeper into the abyss, God allowed her to understand something even more dreadful. The very sins he mocked in life became the torments that clung to him in eternity. It was not merely punishment laid upon him. It was the spiritual consequence of what he had freely chosen. She says that in the darkness the man heard echoes, faint at first, then sharp, then unmistakable. They were his own words, spoken years before, jokes he had made at the expense of believers, insults hurled at the church, proud dismissals of God. Every mockery he had voiced now rose around him like a storm of shadows. These voices, Teresa writes, were not accusations, they were memories that had become torment. For sin that is repented loses its power, but sin that is embraced follows the soul. She understood then that ridicule is not merely an outward act. It forms the inner shape of the soul. Each insult he had spoken at holy things had hardened his heart, and now those same words bound him in chains he himself had forged. The demons repeated his mockeries with venomous delight, not because they needed to remind him, he remembered them well enough, but because they enjoyed watching the soul suffer beneath the weight of its own contempt. He had laughed at God. Now his laughter became the very echo that tormented him. The soul tried to silence the voices, Teresa says, but found it could not, for the mocking words were not external. They came from within, fruits of pride that had grown roots too deep to pull out. In life, the man had used mockery to feel superior, to appear wise, to push away the call of grace. In eternity, that same mockery became the measure of his spiritual poverty. What terrified Teresa most was the moment she perceived the soul's realization. He understood, not fully but dimly, that the very things he mocked had been the only things capable of saving him, and that now, separated from them forever, he saw their value only through the agony of loss. She writes, "I felt the pain of that knowledge pierce him like a fire that cannot be quenched. It was not sorrow that he had sinned, but sorrow that he could no longer repent. The mockery he once wielded as a weapon returned to him as a wound, and in that wound Teresa saw the dreadful truth. Every word that dishonors God becomes a shadow in eternity, unless love destroys it first. Saint Teresa writes that after witnessing the soul tormented by its own mockery, God allowed her to perceive one final truth, one that struck her with more sorrow than the vision of hell itself. She saw how many times, during the man's earthly life, God had offered him mercy. Mercy he brushed aside with laughter. Mercy he treated as nothing. Mercy that might have saved him, had he allowed it to touch his heart. In the vision, Teresa was shown moments the man had long forgotten, a homily that stirred him for a brief instant, a confession he nearly made but postponed, a mass he attended out of habit, where grace reached toward him like a hand, a moment of suffering in which God's voice whispered to his conscience, a friend who gently invited him to consider the faith he ridiculed. These graces, Teresa writes, were small lights placed along his path, but he extinguished them one by one, not by violence, not by defiance, but by mockery. He laughed them away. Teresa explains that grace does not force itself on the soul. It invites, it nudges, it calls, it offers strength, but it does not break down the door. And every time this man mocked what was holy, he hardened the door of his heart a little more. She says the most painful moment of the vision was when God allowed her to sense, not see, but sense, how close he came to conversion at several points in his life. Had he taken even a single step toward humility, mercy would have flooded into his soul. Had he confessed even once with sincerity, the weight that later dragged him downward would have been lifted. But pride kept him from bending. The soul that mocks, Teresa writes, does so to remain above others, even above God. And where pride reigns, grace cannot enter. In the abyss, she saw this truth revealed in its full horror, not that God had refused him mercy, but that he had refused mercy so consistently that he no longer recognized it, not even in the moment of judgment. The light that touched him at death did not comfort him because he had taught his soul to recoil from it. Grace, once mocked, became unbearable. Teresa trembled as she understood the divine logic. Hell is not the absence of God's mercy. It is the place where mercy can no longer be received. Not because God stops offering it, but because the soul stops being able to say yes. And she saw, with unspeakable sorrow, that the gates of hell are locked not from the outside, but from the inside. Saint Teresa writes that when the vision ended, she remained kneeling in silence, unable to move. The darkness she had seen was gone, yet its weight lingered, not as despair, but as a sacred responsibility. For she understood that God had shown her this soul, its fall, its mockery, its self-imposed ruin, not for her alone, but for all who would one day hear her words. This vision, she writes, was a mercy, though wrapped in terror. A mercy because it revealed the truth. A mercy because it exposed the path that leads to ruin. A mercy because it sought to awaken before it was too late. Teresa understood that the greatest danger to the soul is not hatred of God, but indifference to him. Not blasphemy shouted in rage, but mockery spoken with a smile. For mockery disguises pride, and pride disguises spiritual death. She realized with trembling clarity that the man's fate was not sealed by a single act, but by a lifetime of choosing to laugh when he should have bowed. He did not fall suddenly. He drifted. He dismissed. He refused small graces. He ignored warnings. He mocked what he did not understand, and in the end, he became the very thing he worshipped, his own pride. Teresa writes that this vision humbled her more than any suffering she had endured. It reminded her that no one is beyond the reach of pride, and no one is immune to spiritual blindness. Even the devout can grow cold. Even the strong can stumble. Even the faithful can forget the weight of eternity. Her first reaction was not fear, but prayer. She prayed for the man, though she knew he could no longer benefit from her intercession. She prayed for all who live as he lived, and then she prayed for herself, that her own soul might never harden, never mock, never forget the holiness of God. She begged God to grant her a heart that trembles before sacred things, a heart that bends before grace, a heart that recognizes the moment when mercy calls. And she wrote her account for one purpose, so that others might awaken where he did not. Her vision is a warning, not to terrify but to illuminate, a reminder that every soul stands between two eternities, a reminder that what we treat as holy shapes who we become, a reminder that laughter at God becomes chains in eternity, and a reminder that mercy is offered to us now, but it will not force its way into a soul that refuses to kneel. May her vision awaken what mockery silences. May it draw the heart toward the light, while grace still calls our name.